Hi, I'm Dina Rose. Most children are willing to eat a wider variety of foods than parents give them credit for. The problem's really a question of quantity. Kids want to eat 3 bites of broccoli. Parents want them to eat 5. I call this the 2 more bites tango. Eat 2 more bites if you want dessert. But what if we accepted the few bites the kids want to eat? I call this the happy bite, and thought of that as success. A couple of good things would happen. For starters, we parents would feel a whole lot better about how our kids eat. Each time our children took a happy bite of asparagus, we'd congratulate them. We'd feel satisfied. Then our children would feel satisfied, maybe even proud. Next, we'd teach kids to love fruits and vegetables. The 2 more bite tango is a strategy that backfires. Pressuring kids to eat corn makes them dislike corn. Pressuring them to eat peas makes them dislike peas. In contrast, the happy bite replaces the pressure with, well, happiness. Happiness feeds on itself. A few bites of broccoli today will turn into a real portion of broccoli tomorrow. Finally, the happy bite pretty much eliminates overeating. Letting children eat as much food as they naturally desire keeps them focused on their internal signals of hunger and satiety. In the current era of outsized portions, that's a pretty big win. Hi, I'm Dina Rose. If you think children have a built-in preference for bland and boring foods, you're not alone. It's a common myth. But take a look at all the child-friendly foods on the shelves and you'll discover something remarkable. Child-friendly foods are loaded with sugar, salt, and fat. Bland and boring? Hardly. These foods are intensely flavored. So much so that some researchers believe that child-friendly foods have conditioned children to reject fruits and vegetables because peas and carrots don't provide a strong enough flavor hit. Propelled by the idea that we have to give children the flavors they enjoy, many parents feed to their children's taste preferences. But eating is really a matter of math. The flavors children eat most regularly are the flavors they come to prefer. So which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Or in this case, taste preference or food selection? The answer is a bit of both. Children are born with a preference for sweet foods, but cultural influences soon take over. That's why Indian kids like Indian food and Mexican kids like Mexican food. The French have an interesting approach. Rather than encourage their kids to accept individual foods, it's asparagus today. French parents focus on exposing their children, yes, and even their infants, to a wide range of flavors. The obvious benefit is that French kids eat a wide range of foods. The hidden benefit is fewer struggles. When taste development is your goal, rejected foods don't matter as much. So ask yourself, how many flavors are your kids learning to love? Hi, I'm Dina Rose. Do you want to know the easiest and most successful way to introduce children to new foods? A way that won't have you throwing out uneaten helpings and stop you from tearing your hair out? Grow a good taster. Separate eating from tasting. Forget just tasting. If you don't like it, you don't have to eat it, because that pairs tasting with eating. And some kids won't go there, even if they end up liking what they've just tasted. Instead, put on your scientific explorer hat. Examine a pea-sized portion using all your kids' senses. Okay, so we're working with tiny tastes. Where do they come from? And how do you present them without piling on a portion? Consider using a dedicated tasting tool such as a teaspoon or a small bowl or even an espresso cup. Find pea-sized samples by saving peeling pieces or scraps when you're cooking, taking tidbits off your plate, visiting salad bars, looking for giveaways at the grocery store. Now start exploring. Ask your kids to consider appearance, aroma, feel, sound, temperature, texture, and yes, taste too. Think of this as a science experiment. Ask your kids any questions you can come up with except for this one, do you like it? Because the like question is too loaded. It forces kids to make a definitive decision about the new food. But new foods often taste unusual, if not downright peculiar, because they're, well, new, and they need a few trips around the tongue. But try getting an I don't like it food a second or even a third honest effort. And by honest, I mean the kind of tasting where your kids actually taste the food instead of just saying they don't like it the second it enters their mouth. Growing a good taster can take a while, but once your kids can confidently taste a foreign food, they'll move on to actually eating it. Hi, I'm Dina Rose. Parenting a picky eater can be frustrating. We all want the best for our kids, and nothing's more important than nourishing them with healthy foods. But have you noticed that the more you push, the more your kids resist? So rather than begging your kids to try a bite or telling them how worried you are about how poorly they eat, because research shows that these tactics simply intensify things, think about diffusing the situation. Take the tension down a notch. Have a conversation with your children that acknowledges or even apologizes for the stressful situation. Ask your kids to tell you how they feel about coming to the table and about not being able to eat the way you want them to. Chances are your kids know how you feel, but you don't really know how they feel, and the simple act of asking will make your kids feel like your partner rather than the problem. Next, implement the rotation rule. Don't serve the same food 2 days in a row. This isn't about introducing new foods. Rather, it's about teaching your children the right mindset about variety. Use foods your children already accept to switch things up, like cereal one day, eggs another day, and waffles the third day. Because learning to eat different foods on different days lays the foundation for introducing real new foods a little later on. If you combine conversation where you invite your children to share their feelings with the rotation rule, you'll create a positive dynamic and prepare your picky eater for real change down the road.
Hi, my name's Dr. Bob Murray. The Ohio AAP represents general pediatricians, specialists, fellows, and residents who care for children throughout the state of Ohio. As part of its mission, the Ohio chapter performs advocacy at the State House, designs educational venues for the pediatricians, and really promotes a platform to support the child in the state. As part of the educational piece of its mission, the chapter has developed a whole series of CME programs as well as QI, quality programs for practice, and maintenance of certification support to help make it easy for pediatricians to maintain their pediatric certification. We've developed a number of different venues to communicate with pediatricians, including our annual meeting in September, quarterly newsletters and fora that are held around the state covering important novel topics. And most recently, we've developed a whole series of webinars that we're putting on our website, making the website a repository for updating yourself on current issues in the state of Ohio around children, but also an ability to get education at your own speed. The series of webinars will be expanded over time and should give you a great opportunity to perform CME, quality improvement practice, and achieve maintenance of certification at your own pace. We look forward to having you work with us in the future. I'm here to introduce the first webinar in the series by Dr. Dina Rose, who is a sociologist, feeding expert, and parenting expert. Dina has had a tremendous exposure across the country as a consultant, blogger, and author, writing a book called It's Not About the Broccoli. There's a number of points that she's made, but the main message that she wants us to take away is that it's not the specifics of what's being eaten, but more the relationship of the parent and the child, and the parent's strategy for making that an effective interaction at mealtime. She also has a way of making it fun for parents, and I think that is her most endearing trait among people who read her book and listen to her teach. So she's going to do the webinar entitled A Fresh Perspective: How Pediatricians Can Change the Way Kids Eat. The Ohio chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics acknowledges and appreciates the Ohio Department of Health and their support of this project, for which they provided not only funding but also their expertise in this area.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here with you today to talk about how we can help children learn healthy eating habits. I want to start by saying that I am a sociologist, not a nutritionist. I know a lot about nutrition and we can talk about that, but I think it's important to think about how we shape behavior. And it's always surprising to me how few sociologists study how we can teach children eating habits, because as I'm sure you know, sociology is about how parents socialize their children, how they teach them norms and values and shape their behaviors and beliefs. And that's what reading really is all about. So today we're going to talk about a lot of things. I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, but I want to say that it really boils down to three things. I want to talk about why knowing about nutrition isn't enough to change kids' eating habits, then how families produce and reproduce bad eating habits in early childhood, and finally I'm going to talk about how some clinical changes that you can make in your practice that will have a big impact on how children learn to eat. So let's start with talking about why knowing about nutrition isn't enough to change kids' eating habits. This is really a mind shift away from thinking about nutrition and starting to think about eating habits. This is a great study. There are a lot of studies that I could talk about, but this is one that I talk about a lot because it really illustrates the point. The researchers studied a group of French mothers and a group of German mothers in how they were weaning their children in the first 30 days of moving to solids. What they found was that on average, the French mothers gave their children 6 different vegetables. More than 40% provided between 7 and 12 different vegetables. There were 18 changes from day to day, and some made as many changes as 27 in the month. In contrast, the German mothers gave their children 3 different vegetables. No one provided more than 6. More than 80% made fewer than 7 vegetable changes, and no one made more than 13 changes. When the researchers went back to the French mothers and asked them why they did what they did, they said they were interested in taste development. And when they went back to the German mothers and said, why did you do what you did? They said allergies. That sounds a lot like what we do here. This study would make you think that the allergy rate for children under 5 is a lot higher in France than it is in Germany, but it is roughly the same, between 5 and 8%, and that's basically what it is here in the United States. It's even more interesting to think about the interest in identifying allergies when you think about what kinds of foods most babies are weaned on. They're not the highly allergenic foods, right? They're not the milk, the eggs, the peanuts. They tend to be single grains or vegetables. And yet the AAP asks parents to wait 2 to 3 days before introducing each new food. I always tell pediatricians that if there's one change that you can make in your practice, this would be it, because it would make a big difference in how mothers feed their kids, because what ends up happening is that mothers get afraid of what's going to happen when they introduce new foods, and they get into the habit of teaching their children to expect a monotonous diet and not variety. It's even more interesting when we think about the new recommendations that the American Academy of Asthma, Allergy, and Immunology has made, that we should start introducing even potentially allergenic foods to young children and not wait, because this is perhaps one of the reasons why we've seen an increase in allergies over time. The second study that I want to talk to you about that really brings home the habits approach is the power of Hawaiian Punch. In this study, the researchers gave a group of 3 to 5-year-olds a snack of carrot sticks and red pepper slices, and one day they gave them Hawaiian Punch to drink, and on the other day they gave them water. They wanted to see if there was an influence of the drink on vegetable consumption, and what they discovered was that the children ate a larger portion of the vegetables on the water day than on the Hawaiian Punch day. And the researchers were so surprised by this that they said that even after consuming only a small amount of the sweetened drink, the children were relatively disinterested in eating vegetables. So there's a relationship there between flavors and what children are willing to eat. The third study that I want to bring home, and this is the last one we're going to talk about now, is some kids should spit. I want to say up front that this is not what the researchers were studying, but this is what I found very interesting about this study. So there was a group of 4th and 5th graders. They were asked to taste some vegetables 9 times. They had green peppers, tomatoes, carrots, and peas. So 23% of the children spit out the carrots. How many of that 23% do you think didn't like the carrots? If you're anything like me, you would say that all of them who spit out the carrots probably didn't like the carrots. Well, you'd be wrong. It turns out that 31% of the carrot spitters said that they actually liked the carrots. So why'd they spit them out? I don't know. When I do this presentation, a lot of times people will raise their hand and say, well, they're 5th graders. That's what 5th graders do. Maybe they just wanted to razz their parents. Maybe they just didn't feel like eating it. It brings home the point that kids want to eat foods or don't want to eat foods for all sorts of reasons beyond what they like. But the interesting thing about this was that at the end of the study, regardless of whether they were spitters or not spitters, the kids were 5.5 times more likely to like the carrots than at the beginning of the study. So what does all this mean? From a habits perspective, the first study, we really need to think about what does it mean to introduce variety and what is the importance of variety. So first, there's a very small window before kids enter the neophobic stage, the age that happens sort of around 18 months and might kick in around 2 or 2.5, where kids start to narrow and reduce the number of foods that they're willing to eat. And all of the research shows that the more variety before the neophobic stage, the more variety after the neophobic stage. So it's really important to get early variety into our kids' diets. And the foods that are introduced after age 4 are more apt to be disliked than liked. Some of that is a statistical phenomenon that by the time they're 4, they've already been introduced to a lot of different foods, but still they're starting to understand what it is that they like, and so we really need to front load the system and really pay attention to variety in the very early years. The second study, the power of Hawaiian punch. So from a habits perspective, of course, what we want to start thinking about is flavor and how people react to the foods that they're eating. I'm sure you've all heard about the problem with sugar, salt, and fat, of course, from a health and nutrition perspective, but also the idea that there's like a bliss point, and child-friendly foods tend to be very high in sugar, salt, and fat. And this makes kids really want to eat those kinds of foods. We have a common myth in America that children need, prefer really bland food. And it's kind of a myth because if you look at the child-friendly foods that people are eating, they're eating foods that are very high in sugar and salt, right? They're very intensely flavored. And the fat conveys the sugar and the salt flavors even more. So there is research that shows that children, one of the reasons that they might be rejecting fruits and vegetables is because they're looking for what's called a flavor hit. They have a pervasive palate preference already for these intensely flavored foods. Now, they're not the flavors that you and I might be eating, so we're not talking about garlic or we're not talking about chili peppers, but just think about how sweet something is, and that's the food that they're going for. So we really need to start thinking about the power of taste and texture in forming the food preferences and our children's eating habits. And finally, the last study, why some kids should spit. So the first thing that I want to mention about this study that I think is important is that it brings up the idea of what I don't like it really means. So children who are under 5 don't have what's called stable taste preferences. So they really don't know what they like or what they don't like. There was a really interesting study where children were asked to rate the flavors of ice cream that they preferred. And what the researchers found was that if the kids were under 5, then they tended to say different things on different days. One day they liked the chocolate, the next day they liked the strawberry. If they were over 5, they tended to have more stable taste preferences. So we really need to learn that we can't take children's statements about what they like so seriously. Now, What they do have is a stable vocabulary. So they've really learned that they can say, I don't like it, and get out of eating something. And if you think about it from a family dynamic, one of the only legal outs for children, if they don't want to eat what's on the plate, is to say, I don't like it. And how do they learn to say that? Parents routinely say to their kids, just taste it, and if you don't like it, you don't have to eat it. So one of the things, and I'll talk about this at the end, is that we can shape how parents talk to their children and increase their vocabulary so they don't have to rely on saying, I don't like it, when what they're really saying is, you know, that looks really weird, or something like that. This study also brings up the importance of talking about the difference between eating and exposure. So we've all heard the research that shows that children need to be exposed to food, you know, 10 times, 12 times. For parents, that might as well be 1,000,000 times, because the research shows that most parents don't get past 4 or 5 exposures. And that's because they are mixing up the idea of eating with exposure. So they make a new food, they put it on the table, they say, just taste it. If you don't like it, you don't have to eat it, which from a kid's perspective, they hear, if I do like it, I will have to eat it. And we've already seen that there are lots of reasons why kids might not want to eat something. And parents get frustrated because they made that new dish for dinner. And if their kids won't eat it, then they have to do something else. They have to go back into the kitchen, or they have to pull out a sandwich, or something like that. So that's why parents get really frustrated. From a kid's perspective, the idea that you'll have to eat the food on the first or second or third kind of tasting is a lot of pressure. And actually, if we thought about this from a different perspective, we would see that if you knew that your kids were not going to definitely like a food until the 10th time they tasted it, we wouldn't expect them to like it tastes 1 through 9. And that's the mistake that we're making. So we need to scale back and start really thinking about what does it mean to taste a food, and understand that even a small bite is exposure, and that can have a big impact on the way our kids eat. Okay. So how do families produce and reproduce bad eating habits in early childhood? So I want to start by saying that the nutrition mindset is a trap. So the nutrition mindset is what I mean when I think about trying to get nutrients into our kids. So we all know and accept that kids need nutrients. No argument there. There's also a pervasive idea in our culture that the consequences of failing to get nutrients into kids is dire, right? But we have another belief in our society which really makes this difficult, which is that kids don't like healthy food. And so this is the thing that puts parents between a rock and a hard place. The question is, how do you get kids to consume nutrients today when you know that they don't like nutritious foods? And the answer are all the things that you see parents doing. So parents will tolerate child-friendly foods in exchange for nutrients. It's what I call the at least diet. So parents will say, oh, I wish my child didn't eat chicken nuggets, but at least it has protein. Or I wish my kids didn't eat sweetened yogurt, but at least it has calcium. So they make a lot of compromises to get those nutrients into their kids. They feed to their children's taste preferences. They say, well, this is what my child, likes, so this is what I'm going to serve. Parents end up thinking that taste preferences are found more than formed. And so then they serve the same safe food day after day. I mean, it's clear why that happens, and it's understandable. We got to get the job done. We got to get our kids fed. We don't want them waking up in the middle of the night, etc. But it's this repetition of feeding the same foods that ends up creating some of the problems. Parents also engage in what I call the 2 more bites tango, right? Just eat 2 more bites, as if those 2 bites will really add up nutritionally. They trade peas for pie. If you want the pie, you have to eat your peas. They buy nutrition insurance, which is an idea of like, I don't really know how much calcium you've had today, but just to be sure, have a few more bites. And of course, we start to think about how we can healthify child-friendly foods. So can I make a homemade pizza that will have all the nutrients that I want my child to consume, and it's better than the pizza that I could buy down the street. But what you'll see is, from a habits perspective, even if what you're serving is healthified foods, you're teaching kids the wrong habits. So these strategies in combination, trying to get nutrients into kids when we know that they don't like healthy food, produces a diet dominated by mediocre, not healthy foods, right? Kids are eating the at-least diet. It's producing a diet which is characterized by monotony and repetition. That's normal, not variety. And it is also teaching kids that other people know how much they should eat. There's a very small study, but I think it's really illustrative, which came to the conclusion that 85% of parents of young children are really concerned about trying to get their kids to eat more food. And we can't spend the early years of kids' lives trying to get them to eat more and then wonder why they have to spend the rest of their lives trying to think about how to eat less. They also learn a whole slew of other kinds of messages. So for instance, we teach kids to eat for emotional reasons, that it's normal to eat dessert when you're full, right? Rather than telling kids that they should save room for dessert because we don't want them to be overfull, we say you have to eat 2 more bites. And so this is what happens. Kids end up stopping eating when they're kind of full. We come along and make them eat a few more bites. Now they're really full. Then we give them dessert, and now they're stuffed. And so over time, what that teaches them is that it's normal to eat dessert when you're really full. It also teaches kids that eating is an arena for control struggle, and it's normal to eat the same flavors, not to eat different flavors. So the whole package of habits that the parenting techniques produce come from this place, this rock in the hard place, where parents are in kind of a bind, and it ends up producing the exact opposite kind of habits that parents want to teach their kids. Our cultural dialogue about nutrition produces a culture of consumption. And pediatricians inadvertently feed into this system, because one of the things that happens during the well visit is that there's sort of a checklist of asking, have your kids consumed this much milk? Have your kids consumed this many servings of fruit, this many servings of vegetable? So that's really all about getting more food into kids. It focuses on the immediate meal, sometimes even the immediate mouthful, instead of looking at broad patterns and thinking of this as a teaching opportunity that will take some time to implement. And it stresses what kids are eating over when they're eating, why they're eating, and how much they're eating. And finally, it produces a bad family dynamic. It creates all the stress and control struggles that we see. The answer is not to start educating kids about nutrition so much as educating them about habits. The research really shows that talking to kids about health information turns them off. Here's a study that I like to talk about that illustrates that. So children aged 9 to 11 were given 2 identical drinks. One day the drink was described as a new health drink, and another day the drink was described just as a new drink. And which drink do you think the kids preferred? Well, you can see here 55% said that they would like their parents to buy the health beverage, but 85% said they'd like their parents to buy the new beverage. And 45% said that they thought their friends would like the health beverage, but 55% said that their friends would like the new beverage. So health information doesn't work. And by the way, kids are not alone in this. There's other research that shows that Americans widely believe that healthy food doesn't taste as good as junky food. Healthy food is the food that you have to eat, and junky food is the food that you want to eat. And we pass on that idea very early on. So why does this happen? It happens because of what I call the medicalization of the meal. When we focus so much on the nutrients of healthy food, we are communicating the idea that the reason you ought to eat healthy food is because it's good for your body, as opposed to it's good tasting. And if you think about it, it's because we've abdicated the good tasting words to the junk. So when we want our kids to eat a salad or broccoli or an apple or something. We hold it up and we tell them what it's going to do for their body and how great it is for their health. However, when we are giving them ice cream or brownies, we're not going to say, oh, you should eat these brownies because they're full of what? Antioxidants, because they've got chocolate in them. No, we say, eat the apple because it's good for you. These brownies are creamy and rich and delicious, right? So all the good tasting words go with the junk, and all of the health medical words go with the healthy food. And that communicates very clearly that good foods are bad and bad foods are good. All of this also produces a very bad family system, right? So there are lots of examples that I could give. Here's just one. Parents tolerate child-friendly foods in exchange for nutrients, right? The at-least diet. Kids become less tolerant of the fruits and vegetables because of the flavor hit that they're searching for, right? The pervasive palate preference that we talked about, right? The very sweet or very salty kinds of foods. So they reject the vegetables. Then parents start to beg or bribe or barter or use their techniques that we've just also been talking about to get their kids to eat more. And what do the kids learn? Vegetables are awful, eating is about control, and they also learn about external eating, right? Other people know how much you should eat, and that is, of course, one of the precursors of overeating. Here's another one. Parents get in the habit of serving their kids essentially the same breakfast every day. So there's a little bit of variety. We might go back and forth between cereal and waffles or something like that, but we've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 foods that we are comfortable giving our kids in the morning, and it gets the job done. We're busy. Lunch, we do the same thing. The same 2 or 3 foods cycle through lunch. Snack, exactly the same thing. And then dinner, the big daddy of the day, is where we throw in the new food or the variety. So if you look at that family system from eating opportunities, and let's say children have maybe 5, 6 eating opportunities in the course of a day, if most of those eating opportunities are monotonous, are expected, then what children are learning in the long run is that they should expect monotony as the rule, and variety is really the exception, right? We only do variety once a day. They learn a whole host of other lessons, by the way, from this kind of a family system, like I get to choose what I eat for breakfast, lunch, and snack, but mom chooses what I eat for dinner. Or we don't fight about food during the course of the day, we only fight about it at dinner. So there are a lot of unintended lessons being learned in this family system. There's another interesting study that I want to tell you about that came out of the NYU Child Study Center on authoritative parenting. The researchers there got a group of parents whose kids were 4 years old and put them through a series of workshops on how to improve their parenting skills. And I'm sure you know, authoritative parenting is a combination of having some kind of structure, sort of rules and guidelines about how we eat, but also being defined by warmth and nurturing. It's not the authoritarian model where it's my way or the highway, and it's not the permissive model where you can do whatever you want. It's really sort of down the middle. And so they taught these parents some better parenting skills, and what they discovered when the children approached adolescence is that they had better eating habits, they were engaged in more physical activity, they tended to be less sedentary, so they were overall healthier. But what was interesting about this study is that the skills building workshops did not address nutrition, activity, or weight. And so for me, what this shows is that how we teach our children to eat is really about parenting and how we shape their behavior, and much less about the food. So the workshops really focused on teaching parents to be responsive and nurturing, to set limits, to enforce discipline, and to promote positive behavior, and it worked. So what clinical practices need to change? So I want to start by saying there are only 3 habits that translate nutrition into behavior. They are proportion, variety, and moderation. Proportion is the idea that we eat healthier foods more frequently than we eat moderately healthy foods or junky foods. It's really about ratios. Variety is eating different foods from day to day and meal to meal. And moderation is about eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full, and not eating because you're bored, sad, or lonely. A lot of people talk about proportion and variety and moderation with this catch-all phrase, balance. That's the word that we use in our culture to talk about how to achieve healthy eating habits. But the problem with the word balance, and the reason that I don't use it, is that it can mean proportion, it can mean variety, and it can mean moderation. And so what we know from a social science perspective is that when a word takes on too many meanings, it becomes less useful for us. And what I have found in talking to parents is that when they know about proportion, variety, and moderation, then they have a game plan of what behaviors they're trying to implement. I did not make up these terms, proportion, variety, and moderation. I remember distinctly the day that I found out about them. I was doing some research into the food pyramid, and I was deep in the back of the USDA website, and I found the page where they were talking about proportion, variety, and moderation. And you can see here that the USDA states that these concepts are not intended as direct consumer messages. Rather, they're a framework of ideas for professionals, for educators. But I think we would really help parents a lot by talking specifically about these three behaviors. Here are 3 case studies about children who had some eating issues and coming to their doctors, and how it was handled, and I want to talk about how the changes that we made that produced better outcomes. So the first one is Virginia's story. So Virginia, when her mother came to me, was a slight eater. She had low weight. She was sort of in the bottom 10% for weight. But I want to stress that she was not failure to thrive. There were no other health indicators that were a problem, but she was small and she was light. And Virginia's doctor told Virginia's mother to do anything she could to get this child to eat. And this is what happened. Virginia's mom started giving Virginia ice cream 3 times a day because that's what Virginia wanted to eat. And when she came to me, she knew this was wrong, but she didn't really know how to change it. The second story I want to tell you about is Eric's story. Eric was the dream eater. He was the kid that you want to have. He loved nothing more than to eat hummus and fruits and vegetables, and he loved salad, but he was also low weight, but again, not failure to thrive. His parents were told by their pediatrician that they should replace these healthy foods with less healthy foods. So the parents did do that, but I also want to say that one of the things that happened with this family is that they were taking every opportunity that they could to get a few more bites into their son. So if they were going to the park and he was in the stroller, a few more bites. If they came home and they were having a few relaxing moments, a few more bites. They had even resorted to cracking a few jokes, and when he opened his mouth to laugh, putting in a bite or two of food. They were panicked because they were told, get this kid to eat. And the final story is Gina's story. Now, I met Gina when she was about 8 years old, and she was a little bit overweight, but her mother reported that when she was young, she was also a slight eater. And one of the things that Gina's doctor had done was to give her an appetite stimulant. Now, we won't know whether there ever really was a true relationship between that and her being overweight when she was 8 years old, but her mother firmly believes that there was a relationship between those two things. So what did we do? So this is thinking about habits and not about nutrition. With Virginia's story, what we did was I recommended that they serve very small portions, because one of the things that the research shows is that whereas many people will override their fullness, their satiety signals, when they're presented with too much food, people who are undereaters or who are slight eaters, who are not comfortable eating a lot of food, they will actually override They're hunger signals. And so if there's too much food and if there's too much pressure, then they will back off and eat even less. So what constitutes the right portion size for these kids might be an extremely small portion. And so that's what I recommended. And when I say small, I mean really small. 2 bites of chicken, 1 little potato, and maybe a teaspoon of peas or something like that. The other thing is what I call the rotation rule. And the rotation rule is very simple. I recommended that Virginia's parents make a conscious decision not to serve the same food 2 days in a row. And I'm not talking about introducing new foods. I'm just talking about using the foods the child already enjoys and is willing to eat, but creating a little bit of structure to say that we're going to at least alternate every other day. And that teaches an idea of variety that's very important and actually really does lay the foundation for new food acceptance. So those 2 techniques worked to help Virginia start eating better. The solution in Eric's case was to set up what I call the eating zones rule. These are periods of time during the course of the day when food is available and periods of time when food is not available. And this was a really important thing for Eric because it meant that he had a break from thinking about food and eating because he felt a lot of pressure on that front. And this is a really easy concept for most families to implement because they can just look at their schedules and say, essentially breakfast is usually between, let's say, 7:30 and 8:30, and then snack might be at 10 or 10:30, and then so on throughout the course of the day. It's not rigid and set in stone. It's really designed to give parents the idea that if the child refuses breakfast between that 7:30 and 8:30 zone that we've set up, that we're not going to move into the no eating zone to ask the child to eat breakfast. We're going to wait until the next eating opportunity. And for someone like Eric, this means that there's a breather. But for all kids, what it means is that they can come to that meal having developed an appetite. And this can be a problem for a lot of parents, I want to say, because they get afraid that their children will be hungry. But one of the messages that we need parents to understand is that teaching children to be afraid of their hunger is a disservice, and that this is temporary hunger, and it's really building an appetite, and it will help children choose to eat when food is available. In Gina's case, we talked about talking to her about hunger and satiety, and recognizing that even though the party line that we give to our kids is that people only eat because they're hungry, and by the way, that's the second thing that we teach our kids, not just the do you like it or don't like it as an out, but we say, are you hungry or you're not hungry? And so kids start to use the phrase, I'm hungry or I'm not hungry, a little bit manipulatively to get the food or to get out of eating, whichever way they want to go. And it's not so much lying to their parents that causes the problem, but down the road, kids who have been using the I'm hungry or I'm not hungry indiscriminately, they start to believe those messages themselves. And so they get a little bit of out of touch with how hungry they really are. But in truth also, we have to have a dialogue with our kids about all the other motivations for eating. And so people do eat when they're not hungry. We all do it at a celebration. If there's a birthday party and a cake comes out, I might not be hungry, but I'll still have a slice. And of course, in Gina's case, what she needed to learn was how to identify when she was eating because she was hungry or when she was eating because she had emotional feelings that she was coping with through food. Here are the messages that parents need to hear from their pediatricians. The first one is that children don't need to eat child-friendly foods. Indeed, by the age of 2, children can and should eat the same food as the rest of the family. We need to combat the whole food marketing industry, which is telling parents that child-friendly foods are a must. Of course, there have to be some adjustments because kids need to have, choking hazards eliminated, so we need to make sure the food is small, or that it might need to be a little bit more moist, like, we might need to put meat into sort of more of a gravy or something like that to make it easier to swallow, but they don't need a whole different category of food. Parents specifically need to know that they shouldn't stress about nutrients and portion size. They need to really think long-term. Habits. They need to think about proportion, variety, and moderation. They need to hear those words. They need to know that it's not how your child's eating today, but how you're teaching your child to eat for the long run that really matters. After weaning, children should not eat on demand. They shouldn't graze. They really need to learn that there are times for eating and times not for eating. They might not even need to snack. I mean, I know that for some people that's a controversial statement, but I really want to say that the research out there has been all over the board about whether or not children need to snack, whether or not there's a relationship between how often you eat and what your weight is. And of course, if you look over the course of history and you look at other cultures, not everybody has had the same kind of snacking philosophy as we have here in the United States. And when you think about snacking and what snacking is in this country now, it should make us even more cautious about telling parents that their kids need to eat. It's because the bad news about snacking is that it's on the rise, but it's on the rise with all the kinds of foods that you really don't want your kids to eat, right? So most snack calories come from desserts and sweetened beverages, although the largest increase now are in salty snacks and candy. Kids are consuming on average 600 calories from snacks, and it's not being compensated for at mealtime. So the research really does show that for children aged 2 to 6, the daily increase in calories has been 182 over the course of the day. So if they're snacking between meals, they're not compensating by eating less at meals. And some kids are snacking all through the day, which led the researchers in this case to say, because some kids were snacking up to 10 times during the course of the day, they say this raises the question of whether the physiological basis for eating is becoming dysregulated as our children are moving towards constant eating. Parents need to know that they actively shape their children's taste preferences. As I said before, most parents believe that they have to find out what their kids like, and they really don't understand the extent to which they can influence what their kids like. Eating is really a matter of math. Kids like what they're exposed to the most. Point number 5, early exposure to a wide range of tastes and textures is one of the most important feeding strategies. As I said at the beginning, there is really no need to use the go slow weaning approach. Parents also need to know that fruits and vegetables don't need to be served bland and boring because they can't compete with the other foods that kids like. And it's always surprising to me that parents will really go out of their way to make sure that the broccoli is steamed at the same time that they're using the at least diet. And I think that they're related because I think parents feel guilty that they're serving their kids chicken nuggets instead of some other kind of chicken. And so when it comes to the vegetables, they want to be pure about it. But this is a self-defeating strategy. Even something like canned fruit in a heavy syrup or creamed spinach are steps in the right direction, partly because they are sort of flavor friendly in that way, so kids like those kinds of foods, but also because it sets up a mindset for the kids where they start to say, oh yes, I like spinach. And then that's a gateway to introducing spinach cooked in or served in other ways. I often tell of a family that I came across one day in the town where I live, and the mother saw me and she got very excited and she said, I did what you said. And I said, great, what did I say? And she said, I sauteed the spinach and garlic and olive oil and my kids loved it. And of course they did, because that's a delicious way to eat spinach. Parents really need to hear the message that it's time to skip the juice. The way that I would like to think about this is that juice is really a gateway to soda. So while the AAP recommends no more than 4 to 6 ounces of juice per day, the kids who are drinking juice are consuming a lot more. On average, they're getting 10 ounces of juice. And we all know that the kinds of juice that kids are drinking are not things like orange juice. They tend to be drinking apple juice, grape juice, fruit punch, those kinds of foods, which are really just fortified sugar water. And if you look at this slide, you can really see that if you track where calories are coming from over the course of a child's life, you can see that young kids start out by drinking a lot of whole milk and fruit juice, and by the time they're teenagers, soda is the #1 source of calories in the kids' diet. So this is a long trajectory that we need to think about from the get-go. As I mentioned before, parents really need to hear about the rotation rule. Don't serve the same food 2 days in a row. We do that just with the foods that kids are already accustomed to eating. We need to think about proportion. Okay, so it's not just about eating the healthiest foods. I want to show you that you can use proportion to shape how kids eat because we're thinking about their taste buds and their taste preferences. If we think about food from the perspective of 3 categories instead of 2. So, okay, we can all have very sophisticated conversation about nutrition, but parents know that when they're in the trenches, when they're in that playground, when in the schoolyard, wherever they are, they really boil their decisions down to, is this food healthy or is this food junky? And if it's healthy, they say their kids can eat it. If it's junky, they evaluate whether or not their kids have had a lot of junk lately. But that's just too simple an organizational typology, because what ends up happening is that the foods that are the at-least foods, the marginally healthy foods, get lumped with the healthy food. But when you think about taste preferences and the idea that the foods that we eat most frequently are the foods that we come to like, all of the kinds of foods that are the at-least foods, the chicken nuggets, as I've said, or goldfish crackers, or sweetened yogurt, they're all designed to mimic the junky food that we don't want our kids to eat, right? That's how food manufacturers talk about it. Like, here's the food, mom will like it because it has enough nutrients, your kid will like it too because it tastes like junk. Well, if it tastes like junk, then it's pushing our kids' taste preferences in the wrong direction. So we need to think about proportion, not just in terms of nutrients and health, but also in terms of flavor profiles and where the foods that we're most commonly feeding our kids are pushing their habits. And finally, we need to think about how we can teach kids to be good tasters, right? This is not about eating, it's really about exposure. And the key for this is sensory education. There is a burgeoning line of research which really does show that the more kids know about the different kinds of foods, the more willing they are to eat those kinds of foods. So sensory education is really about all the senses, not just what something tastes like. We have to think about texture, aroma, appearance, sound, and temperature. And so what I recommend that parents do is think about exposure, think about giving their children very small samples of something, and then instead of asking, do you like it? Which is really just a thumbs up or a thumbs down critique, right? And we want to stay away from that, because once you get into the thumbs down, who wants to try something again, is we need to ask a series of leading questions that will get children to explore those foods, right? So here are a list of those kinds of questions, and there's a handout that you can get that I've put together that has these kinds of questions. But mostly the important thing is that we get a dialogue going. So if a child looks at something, we can start exploring the color, or we can take a smell and start comparing which one of these has a stronger smell, you know, this food or that food. It almost really doesn't matter what the question is. And so sometimes it pays to get silly. I often tell parents, you know, you can ask your child if this smells like, you know, your baby sister's dirty diaper or daddy's, you know, nasty sneakers or whatever you want. Because all we want to do is stop the automatic rejection, the I don't like it as the food is going into the mouth, to get the kids to start to consider it. And in doing this, we increase their vocabulary so that they can start to have a more sophisticated understanding and discussion about the food. We encourage them to not say, I don't like it, when they want to say is, that looks weird, or that looks yucky, or that has a bad smell, or something like that. And most importantly, what happens is that the more the kids are able to predict what something is going to taste like, because that's what happens. They're sort of building up a data file, so to speak, in their minds about what different foods are like, the more willing they will be to actually eat food because they feel more comfortable with it. So that's the goal here, sensory education. It's a brand new way for parents to think about introducing foods. I often say that they should think about this like it's a science experiment, that eating is not the goal, education is the goal. And even when parents think that that's what they're doing with the just taste it, if you don't like it, you don't have to eat it, in that scenario where the food is on the table at a meal, eating is the goal, because we all have to be honest that deep down what we're hoping for is you'll eat the food so I don't have to go make something else. We want to eliminate the thumbs up, thumbs down of like and dislike, because we want to have repeated exposure. And one of the things that we want to teach kids is that the same food often tastes different, right? Whether it's because I've prepared it differently today than I did yesterday, or because this apple grew slightly different and it has a different flavor profile. So we want them to know that foods are different. We want to incrementally expose them to more difficult foods, right? So some foods are easy to accept, and that's why kids like sugary, salty foods. Those are easy to accept. But when we're talking about a pea-sized sample, we can bump up against things that are more difficult, maybe like a green pepper. And this kind of approach takes the focus off of fruits and vegetables. When we start thinking about exposure, we can open the universe to all kinds of foods. And one of the best techniques is to start kids taste testing foods that they want to eat. Ice cream, crackers, those kinds of foods. Because we want them to think when mom or dad says, here's a new food, they want to say, oh, I want to try that, as opposed to, oh, it's going to be some boring, healthy vegetable thing that I don't really want to try. So it's more fun. So I want to leave you today with one final thought. Indian kids eat Indian food. Mexican kids eat Mexican food. American kids eat hot dogs. We can do better. Thank you.